Part 1, Opening Hook, the birthplace of America. Listen closely. If you stand on the cobblestones of old Philadelphia as the autumn wind sweeps in from the Delaware River, you can almost hear them. You can hear the heavy rattle of carriage wheels on wet stone. You can hear the low, urgent murmur of men gathered in dimly lit taverns, talking of liberty as if it were a tangible thing they could reach out and touch. You can hear the scratch of a quill pen on heavy parchment. It is a quiet sound, yet it carried enough weight to shatter the foundations of an empire. This is Pennsylvania. It is not merely a state defined by borders on a map. It is a vast, living tapestry of American memory. It is a landscape of rolling hills, deep forests, and dark coal veins. It is a place where some of the most profound ideas in human history were transformed from quiet whispers into a loud, undeniable reality. For centuries, this land has served as the anvil upon which the American experiment was forged. Step back in time to the hot, humid summer of 1776, inside a modest brick building known today as Independence Hall. The air is thick with tension. 56 men sit in wooden chairs. They're sweating, swatting at flies, and arguing. They know that what they are about to do could cost them their fortunes, their homes, and their lives. They are about to sign a document that declares all men are created equal. A few years later, in that very same room, another group of delegates would gather. They came to draft a constitution, a framework of government designed to withstand the turbulent storms of human nature. But Pennsylvania's story did not begin with the scratch of a pen. It did not start in the elegant assembly rooms of Philadelphia. To truly understand this land, we must travel much further back. We must go back to a time before the brick buildings, before the iron foundries, and before the cobblestones. We must go back to a time when the land was silent, vast, and wild. Here, in the deep shade of ancient hemlocks, the story of America began to take root. It is a story of faith, struggle, compromise, and endurance. It is the story of a place that would come to be known as the birthplace of America. Part 2. Before the colonies. Long before the first European sails broke the horizon of the Delaware Bay, this land belonged to the forest. It was a realm of endless green, great oaks, towering pines, and massive hemlocks stretched from the Atlantic coastal plain to the rugged ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. The air was clean, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. Through this wilderness ran great, silver rivers, the Delaware, the Susquehanna, and the Allegheny cut paths through the ancient rock, serving as the highways of a vibrant world. This land was home to many indigenous peoples. Among them, the Lenape were known as the grandfathers or the ancient ones. They lived along the valleys of the Delaware River, which they called the Lenapewihatuk. The Lenape did not view the land as something to be owned, divided, or sold. To them, the earth was a sacred provider. In the spring, they cleared small plots of forest to plant the Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash. These crops grew together in harmony, sustaining the soil and the people. In the autumn, the men set out into the deep woods to hunt deer, elk, and bear. They moved with a quiet reverence, taking only what they needed to survive the harsh winters. Further west, along the fertile valley of the river that bears their name, lived the Susquehannock. They were a powerful, agricultural people. They built fortified towns with large longhouses, surrounded by high wooden palisades. They were skilled traders and fierce defenders of their territory. 4 generations. The rhythms of life here were governed by the seasons. The ice would melt from the rivers in the spring. The shad would swim upstream in their millions. The summer sun would warm the forest canopy, and the autumn winds would scatter gold across the mountain ridges. There was a profound balance in this world. The rivers provided fish. The forest provided wood and game, and the earth yielded its harvest. The indigenous peoples built complex societies, forged alliances, and developed rich oral traditions that mapped the stars and the history of their ancestors. But change was coming. Far across the Atlantic Ocean, a restless, crowded continent was looking westward. The quiet of the Pennsylvania forests would soon be broken by the sound of axes, the thunder of gunpowder, and the foreign tongues of men searching for wealth, land, and a new beginning. The old world and the new were about to collide, and the Delaware Valley would be the stage for this great transformation. Part 3. First Europeans in the Delaware Valley. In the early decades of the 17th century, the first European ships began to appear like ghosts along the mid-Atlantic coast. They were looking for many things. Some sought the legendary Northwest Passage, a shortcut to the riches of Asia. Others sought a more immediate wealth, the soft, valuable fur of the beaver, which was highly prized in the coal markets of Europe. The Dutch were among the first to arrive. Guided by the English explorer Henry Hudson, they sailed into the Delaware Bay in 1609. Within a few decades, Dutch merchants had established small trading posts along the river. They traded brass kettles, woolen blankets, and iron tools with the Lenape in exchange for thousands of beaver pelts. But the Dutch were not alone in their ambitions. In 1638, 2 Swedish ships, the Kalmar Nickel and the Fogel Grip, glided up the Delaware River. Under the leadership of Peter Minuit, they established the colony of New Sweden. They built Fort Christina, near what is now Wilmington, Delaware, and eventually pushed northward into what is now southeastern Pennsylvania. The Swedish settlers brought with them a deep knowledge of forest survival. They introduced the log cabin to the American wilderness. This simple, sturdy structure, built from rough-hewn logs notched at the ends, would become an iconic symbol of the American frontier. For a brief time, New Sweden flourished. The settlers farmed the rich river bottomlands, traded peaceably with the local tribes, and carved small pockets of civilization out of the dense woods. But European rivalries soon cast a shadow over the Delaware Valley. The Dutch viewed the Swedish colony as an intrusion on their rightful territory. In 1655, a Dutch fleet sailed up the river and seized New Sweden without a fight. The Swedish flag was lowered, and the region fell under the control of the Dutch West India Company. This triumph, however, was short-lived. Great Britain had its own grand designs for North America. King Charles II looked at the map and saw the Dutch colonies of New Netherland and the Delaware Valley as a wedge dividing his New England colonies from Virginia. In 1664, an English fleet arrived in New York Harbor. The Dutch, outnumbered and unprepared for war, surrendered with the stroke of a pen. The entire region, including the lands along the Delaware River, passed into English hands. The stage was now set for the arrival of a man who would give this land its name, its identity, and its guiding soul. He was a man of peace, a man of faith, and a man with a vision that many in his own time considered dangerous and foolish. Part 4. William Penn and the Founding of Pennsylvania. To understand the birth of Pennsylvania, one must understand the struggle of William Penn. Born into a wealthy and influential English family, Penn had a bright future ahead of him. His father, Admiral Sir William Penn, was a hero of the Royal Navy and a close friend of King Charles II. But young William chose a different, far more difficult path. While studying at Oxford, Penn became attracted to the teachings of the Religious Society of Friends, commonly known as the Quakers. The Quakers were a radical group in 17th century England. They believed that every human being possessed an inner light, a direct connection to God that required no priests, no rituals, and no churches. They believed in absolute equality. They refused to bow to nobles. They refused to take oaths of loyalty to the king. And they refused to fight in wars. In an England that demanded religious conformity, these beliefs were seen as treasonous. Penn was arrested multiple times for his faith. He was imprisoned in the damp, cold cells of the Tower of London. Yet, he refused to recant. Instead, he used his time in prison to write tracts defending the freedom of conscience. In 1681, Penn saw an opportunity to turn his trials into a grand experiment. The English crown owed his late father a massive debt. Penn approached King Charles II with a bold proposal. In lieu of cash, he asked the king to grant him a tract of land in the American wilderness, west of the Delaware River. The king, eager to settle the debt and rid his kingdom of troublesome Quakers, agreed. On March 4, he signed the charter. The king insisted on naming the land Pennsylvania, meaning Penn's Woods, in honor of the admiral. Penn was overjoyed. He did not view this colony merely as a land investment or a refuge for himself. He called it a holy experiment. He wanted to create a society based on the principles of love, tolerance, and justice. In his first frame of government, he wrote words that would echo through the centuries' governments. Like clocks, go from the motion men give them. Let the men be good, and the government cannot be bad. In 1682, Penn sailed across the Atlantic on the ship Welcome. When he stepped onto the shores of his new colony, he did not come as a conqueror. He came as a friend. One of his first acts was to meet with the leaders of the Lenape Nation, including the respected Chief Tamanend, under the branches of a great elm tree at Shakamaxon. Penn and the Lenape leaders sat together. They spoke of peace, friendship, and mutual respect. Penn paid the Lenape a fair price for the land, establishing a treaty of peace that was not sealed with an oath, but with a simple promise. The French philosopher Voltaire would later describe it as the only treaty between those people and the Christians that was never sworn to and never broken. Penn's vision was revolutionary. He promised complete freedom of worship to anyone who believed in God. He established a representative assembly, giving the colonists the power to make their own laws. He designed a capital city with wide, tree-lined streets, named Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. The holy experiment had begun. Its success would soon draw the eyes of the world. Part 5. A colony of tolerance and opportunity. Word of William Penn's holy experiment spread quickly across a war-torn, religiously divided Europe. To those who had spent their lives hiding in cellars to pray, or whose crops had been burned by marching armies, Pennsylvania sounded like a dream. It was a land of peace, a land of deep, black soil, and above all, a land where a man could look his neighbor in the eye without fearing his faith. By the thousands, they began to pack their few belongings into wooden chests and board ships bound for the Delaware River. They came from the villages of the German Rhineland. These settlers, many of them Mennonites, Amish, and Lutherans, were attracted by the promise of religious freedom and the fertile farming land. They settled in the valleys of southeastern Pennsylvania, bringing with them their deep knowledge of agriculture, their strong work ethic, and their unique traditions. Over time, they would become known as the Pennsylvania Dutch, a corruption of the word Deutsch, meaning German. They built sturdy stone barns and cleared fields that became some of the most productive farmland in the world. They were joined by the Scotch-Irish. These were fierce, independent people who had lived for generations in the borderlands of Scotland and Northern Ireland. They were accustomed to hardship and conflict. They pushed beyond the settled areas near Philadelphia, moving westward into the rugged foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. They became the guardians of the frontier, building small Presbyterian churches and carving homesteads out of the rocky soil. English Quakers, Welsh farmers, French Huguenots, and Irish Catholics also made their way to Pennsylvania. This diverse mix of cultures, languages, and religions was unlike anything seen in the other colonies. In New England, religious dissent was often punished with banishment or death. In Virginia, the Anglican Church held a strict monopoly on religious life. But in Pennsylvania, the spirit of tolerance prevailed. The colony grew at an astonishing rate. Philadelphia, which had been nothing but a collection of caves and surveyors' stakes in 1682, quickly transformed into a bustling port town. The combination of fertile land, religious freedom, and a hardworking population made Pennsylvania incredibly prosperous. Wheat, flour, and lumber poured out of the colony's ports, destined for markets in Europe and the Caribbean. Pennsylvania became known as the best poor man's country. It was a place where a penniless immigrant, through hard work and determination, could own his own land, educate his children, and live in dignity. This was the crucible in which a new identity was being forged. It was an identity defined not by bloodline or noble birth, but by shared effort, tolerance, and the pursuit of opportunity. And at the heart of this thriving colony stood a city that was about to become the intellectual and political capital of a new world. Part 6. Philadelphia, the great city of early America. By the mid-18th century, Philadelphia had grown from a quiet experiment into a grand metropolis. It was the largest, most vibrant city in British North America, and second only to London in the entire British Empire. The riverfront was a forest of wooden masts. Ships from all over the world docked at the busy wharves, unloading spices, tea, sugar, and manufactured goods, while loading barrels of Pennsylvania wheat, iron, and lumber. The air was filled with the smell of pine tar, salt water, and roasting coffee. Along the brick-paved streets, lined with neat row houses, walked a diverse crowd of merchants, sailors, artisans, and farmers. And among them walked a man who, perhaps more than any other, came to embody the spirit of the city and the age. Benjamin Franklin. In 1723, a 17-year-old Franklin had arrived in Philadelphia. Dusty, penniless, and hungry, he had run away from his apprentice post in Boston. In Philadelphia, he found a city where talent and ambition mattered more than family pedigree. Franklin thrived. He established himself as a master printer, publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette and the widely read Poor Richard's Almanac. But Franklin was far more than a printer. He was a civic force of nature. He looked at his adopted city and saw ways to make it better. He helped establish the city's first volunteer fire department, its first public library, its first hospital, and its first academy, which would later become the University of Pennsylvania. He conducted pioneering experiments with electricity, proving that lightning was a form of electricity and inventing the lightning rod to protect homes from fire. Philadelphia became a center of intellectual energy. In the city's coffee houses and taverns, men gathered to read foreign newspapers, discuss the latest scientific discoveries, and debate the nature of government. Ideas from the European Enlightenment, ideas of natural rights, liberty, and the social contract, found fertile ground in the minds of Philadelphians. The city's printers produced an endless stream of pamphlets, books, and broadsides. But this prosperity and intellectual growth was heading toward a crisis. Across the sea, the British Parliament was beginning to view the growing wealth and independence of the American colonies with concern. They began to pass taxes and regulations designed to assert their authority, and in Philadelphia, the birthplace of so many new ideas, the resistance to British rule began to crystallize. The stage was set for a revolution. The quiet city of brotherly love was about to become the nerve center of a rebellion that would change the course of human history. Part 7: Pennsylvania and the American Revolution. The tension that had been building for over a decade finally boiled over in the spring of 1775. Gunshots at Lexington and Concord had signaled the start of a war. But the colonies were still divided, unsure of their path forward. They needed a central meeting place, a neutral ground where leaders from across the continent could gather to decide their fate. They chose Philadelphia. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in the Pennsylvania State House. Men of different backgrounds and beliefs sat together in the Grand Assembly Room. There was George Washington, a quiet, commanding planter from Virginia. There was John Adams, a passionate, hot-tempered lawyer from Massachusetts. And there was Benjamin Franklin, now an elder statesman, wise and observant. The debate was fierce. Many delegates still hoped for a reconciliation with King George III. They feared the military might of the British Empire, the greatest superpower of the age. But as the months dragged on, the hope of peace faded. In the hot summer of 1776, a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson sat in his rented rooms at Market and 7th Streets in Philadelphia. By the light of a candle, he drafted a declaration that would alter the course of human events. On July 4, 1875, inside the Pennsylvania State House, the delegates took their fateful step. They voted to adopt the United States Declaration of Independence. One by one, they walked up to the clerk's table and signed their names to the parchment. They knew that their signatures were, in the eyes of the British Crown, a death warrant. Yet, they pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Pennsylvania was now a primary target of the British war machine. In the autumn of 1777, General William Howe led a British army into Pennsylvania. George Washington and his Continental Army fought bravely at Brandywine and Germantown. But they could not hold the city. Philadelphia fell. The Continental Congress was forced to flee, first to Lancaster and then to York, Pennsylvania, where they drafted the Articles of Confederation, the nation's first constitution. Meanwhile, Washington led his ragged, exhausted army to Valley Forge, a windswept plateau just 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge would become a legendary symbol of American endurance. The soldiers lived in crude log huts they built themselves. They suffered from disease, hunger, and biting cold. Many had no shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the white snow. Yet, under the training of the Prussian military officer, Baron von Steuben, they did not break. They learned the art of warfare. They grew disciplined. And they emerged from that frozen valley in the spring, not as a collection of state militias, but as a professional army. The war eventually ended with an American victory. In 1787, the delegates returned once again to the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. The Articles of Confederation had proven too weak to hold the young nation together. The delegates came to build a stronger foundation. For 4 long months, behind closed doors, they debated, compromised, and argued. On September 17, 1887, they emerged with a new document, the United States Constitution. Pennsylvania had not only hosted the birth of American independence, it had hosted the birth of American government. Part 8. The Liberty Bell and the Voice of Freedom. Every great movement needs a symbol. For the American struggle for freedom, that symbol was cast in bronze. In 1751, the Pennsylvania Assembly ordered a bell for the bell tower of the State House in Philadelphia. They wanted a bell that could be heard across the growing city. A bell to call the assembly to meetings and to mark public events. They chose an inscription from the Old Testament. From the book of Leviticus, proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. The words were prophetic, but the bell's journey was trouble from the start. When the bell arrived in Philadelphia from London in 1752, it was hung in the State House yard to test its sound. On the very first strike of the clapper, the bell cracked. 2 local metalworkers, John Pass and John Stowe, took the broken bell, melted it down, added more copper to make it less brittle, and recast it. Their work was completed in 1753. While the bell did not ring out on July 4, as popular legend later claimed, it did ring out 4 days later, on July 8, to summon the citizens of Philadelphia to the State House yard to hear the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence. It was a proud moment, but the bell was soon in danger. In 1777, as the British Army closed in on Philadelphia, the Patriots feared the enemy would capture the bell and melt it down to make ammunition. Under the cover of darkness, they smuggled the bell out of the city in a farm wagon. Hiding it beneath a pile of hay, they hauled it to Allentown, Pennsylvania, where it was hidden beneath the floorboards of Zion Reformed Church until the British withdrew from the city. Over the years, the bell continued to ring for historic events. It rang for the death of George Washington, for the signing of the peace treaty with Great Britain, and for the births of new states. But slowly, a hairline fracture began to grow. In 1846, on the anniversary of George Washington's birthday, the bell rang one last time. As its deep, bronze voice vibrated across the city, the crack widened, rendering the bell forever silent. But its physical silence only amplified its symbolic voice. In the years leading up to the Civil War, opponents of slavery, the abolitionists, adopted the bell as their symbol. They looked at the inscription, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof," and saw a promise that had not yet been fulfilled for millions of enslaved African Americans. They gave it a new name, the Liberty Bell. Today, that silent, cracked bell sits in a glass pavilion in Philadelphia, looked upon by millions of visitors from every corner of the globe. It is a reminder that freedom is a fragile thing, prone to cracking under the pressures of human history. yet worth protecting, worth preserving, and worth proclaiming to all the world. Part 9: Pennsylvania in the Civil War. The mid-19th century brought a new, darker trial to the American nation. The deep, long-simmering divisions over slavery and states' rights finally tore the Union apart. 11 Southern states seceded, forming the Confederacy. Pennsylvania, situated along the Mason-Dixon line, found itself on the front lines of the American Civil War. As a northern state, Pennsylvania was a vital anchor for the Union. It was the second most populous state in the nation, providing over 360,000 soldiers to the Union Army. It was also the industrial heart of the North, manufacturing the rifles, cannons, steam engines, and uniform wool that sustained the Union war effort. But Pennsylvania was not just a supplier of war. It was destined to become its most bloody stage. By the summer of 1863, the war had dragged on for 2 agonizing years. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, had won a series of stunning victories in Virginia. Lee decided on a bold, high-stakes strategy. He would invade the North. He hoped that a major victory on Northern soil would crush the Union's will to fight, force European powers to recognize the Confederacy, and bring a swift end to the war. In June 1863, Lee's army of 75,000 veteran soldiers crossed the Potomac River and marched north into the fertile Cumberland Valley of Pennsylvania. Panic swept across the state. In Harrisburg, the capital, citizens scrambled to build earthworks and hide state treasures. The newly appointed commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, General George Meade, himself a Pennsylvanian, marched his army north to intercept the invaders. The 2 massive armies, numbering over 150,000 men, were like 2 giant monsters moving through the Pennsylvania countryside, searching for one another in the dark. They would finally collide at a small, sleepy market town where 10 roads met, a town called Gettysburg. Part 10: Gettysburg and the Cost of Union. The Battle of Gettysburg began on the morning of July 1. Not by grand design, but by a chance encounter between Confederate infantry and Union cavalry. For 3 hot, summer days, the hills and fields surrounding the town were transformed into a screaming landscape of fire, smoke, and blood. On the first day, the Confederate forces pushed the Union defenders back through the streets of the town. But the Union troops managed to retreat and dig in on the high ground of Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. On the second day, July 2, Lee launched massive assaults against the Union flanks. Vicious, hand-to-hand fighting erupted in places that would forever be etched in American memory: the Peach Orchard, the wheat field, the Devil's Den, and a rocky hill called Little Round Top, and the slopes of Little Round Top. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain led his men in a desperate bayonet charge that saved the Union line from being turned. By the morning of July 3, the Union line had held. Lee, believing the Union center had been weakened, decided to stake everything on one final, massive assault. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 150 Confederate cannons opened fire. It was the largest artillery bombardment ever heard on the North American continent. The ground shook for miles. Then, at 3 o'clock, the smoke cleared. Out of the woods stepped 15,000 Confederate soldiers, formed in neat battle lines stretching over a mile wide, led by General George Pickett. They began their march across an open, mile-wide field toward the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge. It was a magnificent, tragic sight. As they drew close, the Union artillery opened fire. Canister shot tore great holes in the Confederate lines. Yet, they kept marching. They reached the stone wall at the Union Center, where brief, desperate, hand-to-hand fighting took place. But the Union line did not break. The assault, known to history as Pickett's Charge, failed. The shattered remnants of the Confederate Army retreated across the bloody field. The battle was over. Lee's army was broken, and his invasion of the North was turned back. But the cost was staggering. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in those 3 days. The beautiful fields of Gettysburg were covered in shallow graves and the wreckage of war. In November of that same year, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery for the fallen. He spoke for only 2 minutes, but his words would define the meaning of the struggle. He asked that the nation resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Once again, on Pennsylvania soil, the nation had found its true compass. Part 11, Industrial Powerhouse. As the scars of the Civil War slowly began to heal, Pennsylvania entered a new era. The nation was expanding westward, building railroads, cities, and bridges. To do this, America needed muscle. It needed energy. It needed steel and coal. Pennsylvania had them in abundance. Beneath the forested hills of northeastern Pennsylvania lay the world's largest deposits of anthracite, a hard, clean-burning coal. In the western part of the state, the valleys were rich with bituminous coal. By the tens of thousands, miners went deep underground, working in darkness and danger to extract the black gold that fueled the nation's steam engines, heated its homes, and powered its factories. But it was in western Pennsylvania, at the confluence of the Monongahela, Allegheny, and Ohio rivers, that the true industrial giant of the era was born. Pittsburgh, under the leadership of industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, a poor Scottish immigrant who became the richest man in the world. Pittsburgh became the steel capital of the world. Carnegie utilized new manufacturing methods to produce high-quality steel in quantities never before imagined. The sky over Pittsburgh was permanently stained with dark smoke. By night, the sky glowed red with the fire from dozens of massive blast furnaces. The sound of steam hammers, rolling mills, and train whistles was the heartbeat of the city. This steel built the modern world. It built the skyscrapers of New York and Chicago. It built the battleships of the United States Navy. It laid the tracks for the railroads that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. At the same time, in 1859, a man named Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. It was the birth of the modern petroleum industry, sparking an oil rush that changed the global economy forever. This rapid industrial growth was built on the backs of a new wave of immigrants. They came from Southern and Eastern Europe, from Italy, Poland, Hungary, Russia, and Ukraine. They worked 12-hour shifts in the steel mills and coal mines, enduring dangerous conditions for low pay. They brought their cultures, their foods, and their resilience to the valleys of Pennsylvania, creating a vibrant, industrial, working-class culture. The labor movement was born in these very mills and mines. In places like Homestead and Latimer, workers stood up for their rights, demanding fair wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. Pennsylvania's industrial might was a critical engine that helped transform the United States from an agrarian republic into a global economic superpower. The state of William Penn, once a quiet refuge of green woods and small farms, had become the iron and steel anvil of the modern world. Part 12. Pennsylvania. Today, Pennsylvania stands as a unique bridge between its rich historical past and a dynamic, modern future. It is a land of contrasts. In Harrisburg, the state capital, lawmakers gather in a magnificent, dome-topped Capitol building that President Theodore Roosevelt once called the handsomest building he had ever seen. In Philadelphia, the state's largest city, sleek glass skyscrapers tower over the historic brick streets where Franklin and Jefferson once walked. The city remains a global center of education, medicine, and culture, while fiercely preserving its historic heart. To the west, Pittsburgh has transformed itself from a smoky steel town into a clean, modern hub of technology, healthcare, and education. The green hills have returned, and the three rivers are now lined with parks and bike trails instead of steel mills. Yet, just a short drive from the busy cities, one can step back in time. Pennsylvania is home to the largest Amish population in the United States. In counties like Lancaster, horse-drawn buggies still travel along quiet country lanes, past neat white farmhouses where families live without modern electricity, continuing a tradition of faith, community, and simple living that dates back to the early days of the colony. With a population of over 13 million people, Pennsylvania remains one of the most politically and economically influential states in the nation. It is a key battleground in the American political landscape, a state whose diverse voters often reflect the complex soul of the entire country. It is a state that remembers its roots. Every school child here knows that on December 12, 1860, Pennsylvania became the second state to ratify the United States Constitution, cementing its place as an original cornerstone of the Union. From the quiet forests where the Lenape once lived, to the busy ports of Philadelphia, the bloody fields of Gettysburg, and the high-tech laboratories of Pittsburgh, the story of Pennsylvania is the story of America itself. Part 13. Emotional ending. The birthplace still speaks. If you stand today on the high ground of Cemetery Ridge in Gettysburg as the sun begins to set, the long shadows stretch across the grass. The bronze statues of soldiers stand silent vigil. The air is quiet now, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant song of a bird. But if you listen closely, the land still speaks. It speaks of a time when a group of brave men risked everything to declare that we are all born free and equal. It speaks of a time when a divided nation found its resolve and defended the promise of the Union on this very ground. It speaks of the hands that cleared the forests, the backs that mined the coal, and the sweat of those who forged the steel that built a nation. Pennsylvania was not just a place on the map. It was the laboratory of religious tolerance. It was the cradle of American democracy. It was the forge of freedom, the battlefield of union, and the birthplace of America. And as long as the Liberty Bell continues to inspire the hearts of those who seek freedom, and as long as the ideals of equality and justice endure, the story of Pennsylvania will continue to speak to the world. A story of endurance, a story of hope, a story of a nation born in the woods of peace.